Dustin, thank you very much for that introduction. Yeah, singing with Willie Nelson, it doesn't get any better than that. And people watch that show. The first email I got the next morning was from the U.S. commander of the American military forces in Afghanistan. What are you doing watching? And Skip said I could tell you the story. I said to Willie, we rehearsed this, and I promise you I'm not going to sing today. And my kids don't want to hear me sing. Singing on national television with Willie Nelson, wow. And so we rehearsed, and between rehearsal things I said to him, now Willie, we're both supporting the same candidate in 2008, right? Who you support? He said, I said, I'm supporting Hillary Clinton, obviously. Who else? He said, right, I'm supporting Hillary Clinton and Dennis Kucinich. I said, okay, we'll take it. Then he says, I said, that's kind of odd. He said, if I guess Dennis doesn't have as good a chance as she does. I'm just delighted to be here. Skip, thank you for inviting me. This is a fantastic facility. I live across the street from Polshak's other great creation, the one in New York, the Planetarium, and 81st and Central Park West. And actually, we're going to be in that building honoring President Clinton for his work on AIDS at the annual dinner that my AIDS organization gives. Bill Clinton has done more for AIDS than any other person in the world in the last 6 years, and we're going to be delighted to honor him. And I've come here today at Skip's invitation to talk to you about public service. I am thrilled that you have a Masters of Public Service here, not a Masters of Public Administration. I always hated that word. You know, Princeton and Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, all have these schools of public administration and international affairs. The one in Columbia is called School of International Affairs and Public Administration, or something like that. And I don't like that word, administration. This is about public service. That wonderful film that I just watched, Skip, shows that again. And if you're going to the government, and I hope many of you will, some of you have, or if you give part of your life to public service as a private citizen, in a humanitarian organization, or a church group, or a community group, you're not doing it for the money, and you shouldn't be doing it for career advancement. You should be doing it to give something back. And that's what it's all about for me. I joined the government because when I was a sophomore in college, Kennedy was inaugurated, made the incredible inaugural speech, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And so our generation was going off to the freedom riders down to the South. And I must emphasize to the younger people in the audience, the South was a different country in those days. And coming down here was high risk for these people. They took big risks. Some of them got beaten up badly, as you all now know. And they went to places like Selma and Montgomery and Greensboro. And others joined the Peace Corps. And I went into the State Department. That was public service to me. And so I'm just delighted that you have this, and I know under Dean Rutherford, you never think of Skip as a dean, but he is now a dean. This is going to make a great contribution. You may be the first Skip, but you won't be the last. So Skip and Patrick and I were talking about what I had to talk about today. In the questions and answers, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have on any issue. And I know that my book will be available afterwards too. If you want to buy it, I'll be happy to sign it. But I wanted to talk about something a little different, the kind of dilemmas that you could encounter if you're in the government. And I wanted to do it from a historical point of view. Imagine that you're a consular officer in the middle of a diplomatic career. You hope it'll lead to an ambassadorship. Imagine that in front of you on your desk are two rubber stamps. One says approved, and the other one says rejected. Use the one that says approved, and the desperate family sitting in front of you will be able to travel to your country legally on a visa. Use the other stamp, the one that says rejected, and you could be sending that person to prison or even to death. Now, this sounds like a pretty easy choice, doesn't it? But there's a very big catch. The person in front of you is Jewish. The year is 1940. And your boss has told you to devise ways not to use the approved stamp. Your government doesn't want these people waiting outside your office, milling around in the street, hiding in their houses. They don't want that person in your country. You approve too many visas and your career will be in danger. Follow instructions and people will probably die. What would you have done if you were faced with this situation in Marseille, or Bremen, or Hamburg, or Lyon, or Lisbon in 1940? Or what would you do if you were faced with the same situation today involving, for example, refugees from Iraq? In the movies, the hero stares out the window, the music swells, and the hero does the right thing. Remember Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca? That's what that film was about. The letters of transit were the way to get out of Casablanca. But in the real world, there are few heroes in such situations. Government service is based on a well-founded principle that career officials must follow instructions. If they didn't, anarchy would prevail in governments. But what happens if the instructions you're supposed to follow have horrible, even lethal, fatal consequences? But not heeding them means jeopardizing your career. You know, after World War II, we mocked, and the older people in the room will all remember this, we mocked Germans who said we were just following orders and they didn't know about the death camps. But a similar rationale was used by an overwhelming majority of non-German diplomats in Europe during the 1930s to deny Jews entry into their country. For every diplomatic hero like Raoul Wallenberg, there were hundreds of consular officials, hundreds, maybe thousands, who played it safe by following orders to keep Jews out of their countries. As a result, hundreds of thousands of Jews whose lives could have been saved were left to fend for themselves. Most died later in concentration camps. This wasn't just a case of officials passively following instructions. Take, for example, the following letter written by the Brazilian consul in Lyon, France in 1940. He proudly wrote his foreign minister that the people swarming around his office were, and I quote, almost all of Jewish or Semitic origin, and only a few of them may be of interest to us in Brazil. I believe that by my categorical refusal to grant the visas they request, I will have done Brazil a great service. Yet a handful, a small handful of diplomats, Brazilians, Chinese, Dutch, Italians, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, Swiss, Turkish, Vatican, Yugoslav, and even one or two Japanese and German consular officials risked their careers, their reputation, and sometimes their lives to save those who were in danger. Mostly Jews they didn't know, because they believed their instructions were immoral. Tens of thousands of lives were saved by these heroes. There is an investigation that's carried on to identify them by the Commission for the Designation of the Righteous among nations at the Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority in Jerusalem, more universally known to many of you, I'm sure, as Yad Vashem. And if it weren't for that investigation, we would not even know the names of these people. It wasn't the Germans who punished these brave men and women. It was their own governments. Yet in the face of these risks, a few diplomats showed great moral courage, knowing full well what they might pay for it. The most famous of these, of course, was Raoul Wallenberg, whose courage and creativity are now legendary. He paid with his life, not at the hands of the Nazis, but at the hands of the Soviets, who thought he was a U.S. spy. Wallenberg, a member of an aristocratic Swedish family, had been sent to Budapest on a special humanitarian mission by President Roosevelt, which he expanded to include an unauthorized crusade to save Jews, even creating fake passports and papers with a fake seal on it to convince the Germans that these were legal, authoritative papers. He knew that Germans would respect official seals, so he just invented one. Saved tens of thousands of people. When the Soviets got to Budapest, they thought he was an American spy. They took him off to the Gulag, and he disappeared forever. My wife wrote the first book in English on Wallenberg, and so I've been very steeped in this extraordinary story. And some of you may know that his niece, Nana Nan, is the wife of Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN. But Wallenberg is world famous, rightly so. Most of those we're talking about here were given more routine consular diplomatic assignments, only to find themselves in an unexpected moral dilemma of historic dimensions. Consider, for example, the astonishing story of Aristide de Sousa Mendes, the Portuguese consul general in Bordeaux. After the Portuguese dictator Salazar prohibited the issuance of transit visas to stranded Jewish refugees, Sousa Mendes, a devout Catholic with 11 children, visited the stranded Jewish refugees on the streets. He then retreated to his house, and he tossed and turned in his bed for 3 nights, sweating profusely. Then he emerged, and according to his son, flung open the doors to the chancery and announced in a loud voice, "From now on, I'm giving everyone visas." Sousa Mendes later told his sons he'd heard a voice, that of his conscience or of God. For a few weeks in June 1940, Sousa Mendes was in a frenzy, issuing visas as fast as he could, even going to the Spanish border to make sure that skeptical border police would honor them. He knew he was racing against his own government. In July, he was removed from his post and subjected to a nasty investigation, personally supervised by Salazar. But Sousa Mendes was unrepentant. "My desire," he said, "is to be with God against man, rather than with man against God." His superiors thought he was crazy, literally told the tribunal that he was. He was dismissed from government service, and although supported by the Jewish community in Lisbon, died in poverty. Not until after the fall of the Salazar government did the Portuguese restore his name and honor. Today there are schools and streets named after him in Portugal. So far, Yad Vashem has not honored any American official as a righteous among nations, although it has recognized 2 or 3 Americans, private Americans, who did similar work under great danger, but no officials. Only one, Hiram Bingham IV, appears to be under serious consideration. He deserves, in my view, to be honored. Bingham defied the infamous Breckinridge Law, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in the State Department in the 1930s, a job I held under President Clinton, and whose picture is on the wall of all my predecessors, so I'd pass it to my office every day. This is a truly infamous man in American history. Breckinridge Law outmaneuvered Eleanor Roosevelt when she tried to get more visas issued to Jews. He instructed his counsels, quote, to put every obstacle in the way and postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas. Breckinridge Law removed Bingham from his post in Marseille and replaced him with an officer who enthusiastically carried out Long's anti-Semitic policies. The situation brave men such as Wallenberg, Sousa Mendes, and Bingham faced are not just ancient history. You may think, well, that's 65 years old, it can't happen today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is happening today. And where's it happening? Iraq. Since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, The United States government has allowed only 466 refugees to enter the United States, even though more than 2 million have now fled the country, mostly to Jordan and Syria. Among those desperately seeking safety are thousands of Iraqis who worked with or supported U.S. personnel in Iraq. These are people who interpreted for the military, took the greatest possible risks, are in the greatest possible danger. I don't know how many of you saw the 60 Minutes piece on this a few weeks ago. Did any of you see that piece? Then you know what I'm talking about. In an embarrassing interview on 60 Minutes, Ellen Sauerbay, the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, said that the small number and slow processing was the result of new post-9/11 security requirements. This is crazy. Even Iraqis who were given security clearances to work with U.S. troops in combat conditions in Iraq, where they could have betrayed the Americans to ambushes had they been traitors, are now waiting years and years to get approval. And they're not in the embassy, that $1 billion embassy that this administration is building in Baghdad, inside the Green Zone. By the way, there was an attack inside the Green Zone this morning on the Parliament. Even that $1 billion embassy does not issue visas. If you're an Iraqi who wants a visa, you have to go to Jordan, or you can't go to Syria, you have to go to Jordan. It's a terrible system. Yet Sauerbay boasted about increasing this year's Iraq refugee quota to 7,000, a pathetically small number given U.S. responsibility for the desperate plight of fleeing Iraqis. Under similar circumstances, from the fall of Saigon in 1975 through the end of Jimmy Carter's administration in 1980, I was president, as Dustin said, I was President Carter's Assistant Secretary of State, so I was very involved in the refugee issue. Presidents Ford and Carter took in well over 500,000 refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia. How did we deal with the security issue, which always existed? They might have been communists, they might have been Khmer Rouge. Simple. We sent them to a camp of first asylum in the Philippines or Thailand or Malaysia. And then we screened them. Some of them actually came to Arkansas, but I don't want to get them mixed up with the famous Mariel boat lift, which was contemporaneous and which was one of the main reasons, of course, that Bill Clinton lost his second election campaign in Arkansas for governor. These were two very distinct issues, although some of those refugees were screened before Chafee. Today, those 500,000 Indo-Chinese refugees are a vibrant and growing part of American life. In fact, if it were not for Senator Edward M. Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, who has made refugees a prime concern of his for over 40 years, the Bush administration would have done nothing about the issue. And if you want to know what it means for the Congress to change hands, it's that as soon as Kennedy became chairman of the committee in January, he held a hearing on this, and that's how the issue started to get height, and they didn't even know about it in the administration. So Ted Kennedy, who's never received the credit he deserves on refugees, but who I first met in Vietnam 41 years ago on this very issue, has a great track record and deserves to be recognized for it. President Bush has yet to mention the issue in public. That the sorry story of the 1930s is being repeated with so little public outrage is more than disturbing. It is shameful. Why is the White House doing so little? And where are the internal Binghams and Sousa Mendezes of 2007? Every age will present people in positions of authority with similar difficult decisions. The details will vary, but the challenge will remain the same. If you were in such a situation, would you realize you were in it? And I speak particularly to the young students here looking for a public service career after getting their MPS, if you did realize it, what would you do? Thank you very much.
you very much, Ambassador. I think we have the time for a few questions, and I'd like to start off by asking you, in light of the growing tension between the West and Iran, how do you think that this administration and possibly the next ought to deal with them?
Let me start by talking about a real-time event, Speaker Pelosi's trip to Syria. She is being attacked right now for going to Damascus in a delegation that included Tom Lantos, the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a couple of other congressmen, and some Republicans. And the Vice President of the United States said that it was bad behavior in an interview on Rush Limbaugh the other day. Yet the Baker-Hamilton Commission said clearly we should talk to Iran and Syria. And the administration ignored it. I think Nancy Pelosi did exactly what was appropriate for members of Congress. It's a separate branch. We always should encourage members of Congress to travel. When President Clinton decided to send the troops to Bosnia after the Dayton Agreement, as I write in my book, did I mention it's going to be on cinema? We were hammered by the Congress. Newt Gingrich, as Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's current job, got a 3-to-1 vote against President Clinton for sending troops. So what did we do? We organized congressional delegations to go to the region, and everyone came back understanding. What she did was entirely appropriate, and she advanced the cause of understanding. Similarly, on Iran, let's start with what we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be refusing to talk to them. On the nuclear issue, we should be willing to talk to them about these issues instead of making the outcome of the talks a precondition for those talks, which is the current administration position. Now, Iran itself. Iran is a very, very dangerous problem. It sits between Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're engaged in 2 wars. We are going to, this administration will pass both wars on to the next President of the United States, and she's going to have a real dilemma dealing with it. I talked to Hillary about this. I said, why would you want to be president with that kind of problems? But I hope she's president. I think she'll be a great president. You cannot fix Iraq till you cannot fix Iran until you've dealt with Iraq, because the Iranians can micromanage the level of our involvement. They can tie us down. They can operate. They know they're staying in the neighborhood, and the holy places of Shiism, Najaf and Karbala, are in Iraq. And everybody knows sooner or later the U.S. will leave. The only question is how and when. In my view, Iran poses a huge problem for us with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel, with nuclear weapons, with Iraq, Afghanistan, high energy prices. They are a really disruptive problem. We need to isolate them, focus on them, and at the same time talk to them. And this administration has not done that. I do not think, Dustin, that this administration is likely to make a significant change. But they might, because the objective realities are so overwhelming. I started with the Nancy Pelosi story, even though you asked about another country, because it illustrates a mindset about the value of diplomacy, which I just profoundly disagree with. Before I went to, during the shuttle diplomacy, which is described in my, did I mention my books? During the shuttle diplomacy, we faced a very tough decision. We knew as we traveled around the region that sooner or later Milosevic might produce Mladic and Karadzic, who were and still remain the 2 most wanted war criminals in the Balkans. Mass murderers of the worst sort. And we had to decide whether we'd meet with them or not if they suddenly appeared. And we kind of guessed when they might appear, and we guessed exactly right. But I talked to the president about this beforehand. And I was influenced both by my wife's book on Wallenberg Holbrooke's position was, I'll negotiate with the devil, and he did. The man he negotiated with in Budapest in 1944-45 happened to be named Adolf Eichmann. And he said, I'll negotiate with Eichmann because the people who are not yet dead can be saved. And that was one model, and the other was what President Clinton said, quoting Itzhak Rabin just before Rabin's murder, which happened while we were at Dayton. Quoting Rabin, he said, Rabin had said to him, and I think, Skip, you know that this is one of President Clinton's favorite quotes, you don't make peace by talking to your friends, you talk to your adversaries. And on that basis, why don't we talk to the Iranians and the Syrians when they are two of the neighbors of the country in which we are now trapped?
You spoke in New York a few months ago. I was there, and mentioned that you thought that whether or not we pull out of Iraq, we might need to go to Afghanistan and stay for as long as 10 to 12 years. With the situation in Iran, is that even more presidential, or does that change that opinion at all?
No, I did say that, and in fact, I've written that many times. I was in Afghanistan exactly a year ago, when there were no international journalists there at that point, except one New York Times reporter and one Washington Post reporter. Everyone else had left the story. And I wrote a column for the Washington Post saying, and this is what your question refers to, saying that Afghanistan was where 9/11 came from, that the war was not going as well as it should, that the drug policy was a complete bust, and that the insurgency was going to get stronger. And then I wrote, as you alluded to, that we'd be in Afghanistan much longer than we're in Iraq, and it's a bipartisan issue. I did write that, and I still believe it, but I want to tell you a little footnote. After the column came out, two of the highest-ranking people in the U.S. government and the administration both called me, and they both said I was too pessimistic. And I will never forgive them for that call. Those calls, because I said, didn't you understand the point of the column? I was saying that the Democrats will make Afghanistan a bipartisan issue, because Iraq is not a bipartisan issue. It's a tremendous, but no one in the Democratic Party is opposed to the Afghanistan issue. And the administration has zeroed out the request for funds for Afghanistan. That is to say, they had cut it from billions down to a tiny amount of money. $40 million was all they asked for in Afghanistan in the year I wrote the column. They've now gone up to something like $6 or $8 billion. And they'll get it. The Democrats support it. And yet these two people were saying I was too pessimistic, I was being partisan. I reread the column a few weeks ago. I was too optimistic. It's much worse than that. So yes, I still believe that. Why do I believe it? Because if we leave Afghanistan, the Taliban will come back, and the Taliban will bring back with them Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda is already operating, arresting, recuperating, training, and planning on the border area between Afghanistan and Pakistan, Waziristan, and northern Baluchistan. That's bad enough, but to give them back Afghanistan is would be a tremendous problem. So this is going to be very tough. Afghanistan is not an easy place to do this. And everyone knows that Afghanistan has been the graveyard of foreign interventions. The British got decimated there in the 1840s. The Soviet Union, the Soviet downfall began in Afghanistan in the 1980s. This is tough, but it has to be done, and there's a way to do it correctly.
Ambassador Holbrooke, could you comment on your opinion of the current status of the Middle East peace process and any prospects for the quartet to reinvigorate the process?
You know, the prospects are pretty bleak right now, because on the Palestinian side, Hamas and Fatah are in this big argument over who's in charge, and on the Israeli side, the government is quite weak right now. There's a commission is about to come up with findings on the Lebanon events of last year. And the Israelis, they're not weak militarily, they're having a political struggle. But the real problem is that, in my view, that you can't negotiate with Hamas right now. I just don't see it. And finally, you mentioned the quartet. I don't completely understand the quartet. The quartet, for those of you who have been following it as closely as you have, the quartet is the United States, the European Union, the Russians, and the UN. Now, the UN isn't an organization or a country like, it's a collection of 192 states, so the UN meant the Secretary General. It's an unwieldy group. The US has to take the lead in the Middle East. And from Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger in 1973, right straight through to the last hours of the Clinton administration, that is, 1973 to 2001, 28 years, the U.S. at the presidential and secretarial level were continuously engaged in the search for peace in the Middle East. Some presidents and secretaries of state were more successful than others. Ironically, the most successful president in that 28-year period was Jimmy Carter. He got Israel and Egypt to sign a peace treaty, and that took a war between the two countries off the table. A lot of its terms weren't implemented, relations aren't very good right now, but that war frontier was taken away. Bill Clinton got the ball down to about the 5-yard line in his efforts at Camp David and in the closing hours of January of 2001. The day he left office, the next administration, the current administration, ended the special envoy system, said we're out of the peace business. Now, even the presidents who didn't succeed, but fully succeed by involvement, kept the lid on the violence. By removing the U.S. as a factor, the worst elements came out of the woodwork, and the violence escalated, the tensions escalated. And now the Secretary of State has made 4 trips to the region in the last 2 months. She has personally become the envoy. Again, I don't agree with that process of what she's done. I think the Secretary of State should hang back. She's the highest appointed official in the United States, and it's very prestigious, and she should have an envoy the way President Clinton had Dennis Ross, who clears the way, and she should go in when the ball has been moved at least halfway down the field. And what's she producing? She's producing empty handshakes. Her last trip, she said that she had produced an agreement that Olmert and Abbas would meet every 2 weeks. If I'm not mistaken, that was more than 2 weeks ago, and they haven't met, and the press hasn't even mentioned it. This isn't the way to do it. This is not serious. So, the bottom line, it's again, and I know this sounds like a broken record, we're going to need a new way of thinking in the executive branch to match the new winds in Congress if we're going to get our country back into the position of leadership which it must have in the world, and which it had under most of the presidents, including Jimmy Carter, who gets overly abused sometimes for his president. I totally disagree with the book he wrote, but that's different. He really worked these problems. Bill Clinton, unbelievable engagement. Look at his leadership. Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, the Middle East. He tried to get a Cyprus settlement. I was his envoy. We didn't get there, but he tried. He cared about these things. He was right to care about them. And this administration, there's some very good people in this administration, really are, friends of mine. The one exception to my criticism I just made is North Korea. In North Korea, the Bush administration reversed its position of not talking to North Koreans except in a 6-party context, which was meaningless. Allowed their negotiator, Chris Hill, under the Assistant Secretary of State, to negotiate secretly and bilaterally. And they produced a tremendous breakthrough. And I can tell you, because Chris Hill was my deputy at Dayton, and in fact is on the cover of my book. Did I mention? Chris Hill is a tremendous diplomat, somebody who President Clinton and Senator Clinton know well. And he's doing diplomacy 101, and it's working. You know, we don't have to, Dustin was asking me earlier if we need a whole new paradigm for American foreign policy. I would say we need a whole old paradigm. Let's just get back to what America did when America led the world from Roosevelt through Clinton. What has happened? I'm not trying to just make a political point here. It's genuinely puzzling why they won't talk to Iran, Syria, discontinue the envoy system. And the one area where they move into something on a traditional basis, a very skilled professional diplomat produces a really good result. And immediately upon producing it, he's attacked publicly by John Bolton, who George Bush sent up to the UN as a recess appointment, tried to get confirmed twice, and what does he get in return? A public attack by Bolton on Bush. I mean, he gets publicly attacked by Bolton for doing this. Go figure. It's really weird, but that's the way it is these days.
Oh, great. I have a different kind of question. My name is Dr. Kelly, and I'm a former educator, and now I'm a student at the Clinton School. And in the context of Gandhi's perspective, if you want peace, start with the children. So I want to give you a hypothetical for the future. You're the Secretary of State, and one of your best friends has become the Secretary of Education. What kind of advice would you give educators in this country and around the world to teach young people the kinds of skills that you have in conflict prevention, conflict resolution? And this is beside the new skill that we learned from you about keeping spoons in your jacket pocket for certain kind of ice cream disputes. But what do we need to teach people in order to spread democracy, conflict prevention, and those kinds of skills?
You like those spoons, huh? We had Willie Nelson and Stephen Colbert, each with their own ice creams. And Colbert is screaming and yelling at Willie, "Why, you're a living legend. Why do you want it all? Leave something for little Stephen." And then I'm supposed to negotiate that they each taste each other's ice cream. And so Colbert says, "Does anyone have spoons?" And I pull out 2 spoons. And the negotiator always travels with spoons. It's fun. And obviously, you can see by the response here, that's first of all, in education, I could say just get everyone to do what Skip and President Clinton are trying to do in this magnificent facility, and but the truth is that you learn these skills through experience, and you may not always succeed anyway. And it's a very complicated thing. I've talked a lot about this in the book, actually, because I think it's such an important issue. For me, the learning experience was not something at school. I don't have a lot of respect for what is taught in the schools of conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and negotiating techniques. It was really I learned most by observing a failure, and that was the 1968 Paris Peace Talks on Vietnam, where Averell Harriman and Cyrus Vance headed our delegation, and we could have and should have ended the war, but we didn't. And why we didn't is another story. But you can learn more from failure than from success, because success appears foreordained when it may just be luck. On younger people, the root causes of so much of what we see in the world today is the miseducation of younger people. If they're taught bad history, they're going to grow up with false lessons, and they'll carry them into their adulthood. We were talking, Skip and Dustin and Patrick and I were talking earlier about the textbooks in the Middle East. Palestinian textbooks and Arab and Saudi textbooks don't show Israel on the maps. And that means that you're starting to train young Palestinians and Arabs at a very young age of false history that also doesn't mention the Holocaust. So by the time they grow up, we've got a ready terrain for terrorists or sympathizers or whatever. In Bosnia, people, Muslims, Serbs, and Croats who speak the same language, eat the same food, went to high school together, played on the same basketball teams, and started to tell each other false history exacerbated by radio and television giving completely false history, going back all the way to 1389. In Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis had intermarried and lived together, and suddenly a lingering tension exploded into an incited genocide. And I stress the word incited because the press in 1994 covered it as an African tribal massacre, kind of something savage. It was just as planned as the Holocaust. They were broadcasting the license plate numbers and the names of people and telling them to go out and get them. If you've seen Hotel Rwanda or the other films, you know this story. So education is critical. I wouldn't say this to the Secretary of Education because his or her job is domestic U.S. This is for the State Department and the White House. And there is a job called the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. It's currently held by Karen Hughes, the Texan who was George Bush's closest manager of his image. And she famously, this is the job, one step removed that Edward R. Murrow had under President Kennedy. It's a huge job. It should go to some major national figure who understands how to present the nation, backed up, like Tom Brokaw, for example, backed up by experts in how to communicate with Islam. And she made her first trip in the region, taking a lot of press along, which was idiotic, and famously went to Saudi Arabia and told the women there how bad it is that they couldn't drive cars. Well, I have two reactions to that. One is, whether they drive cars or not is not America's national interest, it's a local issue. And by the way, the Saudi women, since they were elite, were horrified. Why would they want to drive cars? That would be demeaning. They have chauffeurs. So she was, and then she said, I'm an ordinary American housewife and working mom. And they're thinking, working housewife, what is she talking about? It was completely culturally tone deaf. Now, I'm not defending the way women are treated in Saudi Arabia. I've been there. It is unacceptable to all of us. And there are some small signs of change in Saudi Arabia. But her job is to deal with the growing antipathy towards the United States. When Bill Clinton left office, we were so popular. Just take one critical country, Turkey. Our most important frontline state, Turkey, NATO ally, on the border of Iraq, Iran, Russia, and of course their long-standing problems with Greece. When Bill Clinton left office, 60% of the Turks thought we were their best friend, and that had been true since 1945, when Truman had put in the roots of the current relationship. Today, the number is about 10 or 11%, and this is our all-important critical NATO ally. And this morning, the head of the Turkish General Staff talked about the fact that they're ready to invade northern Iraq to deal with the Kurdish problem, and which of course would create another war in the region and put us in an absolutely untenable place, because if the Turks do invade northern Iraq, you know who their ally is going to be? Iran, because of the Kurdish issue. So we'll have a NATO ally allied with the Iranians. This is dangerous stuff. It's a result of the problem you're talking about. And it's very serious, and I hope the next president will put into place a world-class Edward R. Murrow, modern version of Edward R. Murrow to deal with this problem. We cannot regain our position in the world if we don't recognize that it isn't just fighting terrorists, it's fighting the ideas that make people ready to kill themselves in pursuit of a false God.
Really enjoyed your talk today, especially about the refugee from the 30s into today.
Thank you.
And also, hope you have your spoons, because I was thinking, maybe you could get Ted Kennedy and our Vice President together and see if Holbrooke can take care of some of those refugees And do I.
Well, Cheney's invited Kennedy to go hunting with him. Thank you very much. I'm going to officially turn over my spoons to Skip Rutherford when I leave. So
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Given what you've learned, or what you learned and applied in your integral participation in the conflict resolution in the Balkans, could you apply any of that to the conflict resolution in Iraq? If not, could you make a case for Iraq remaining as a unified whole? And if this is in the book, I'll buy it anyway.
No, I don't talk about Iraq in the book, but and it has been suggested many times, most notably by Tom Friedman in his columns, in the New York Times and elsewhere, that we do a Dayton for Iraq. And I'm flattered by the reference, but the truth is you can't do it. We could have and should have done it earlier. Skip, may I conclude though, because this question triggers it, by just reading the last paragraph of the book because it's relevant. I just want to, this is how I ended the book. Of course, this was written, as Dustin said, in 1998. The circumstances that led to the collapse of Yugoslavia were so extraordinary that it's difficult to conceive of their recurrence. Yet if history teaches us one thing, it is that history is unpredictable. There will be other Bosnias in our lives, different in every detail, but similar in one overriding manner. They will originate in distant and ill-understood places, explode with little warning, and present the rest of the world with difficult choices between risky involvement and potentially costly neglect. But if during the Cold War Washington sometimes seemed too ready to intervene, today America and its allies often seem too willing to ignore problems outside the heartland. There will be other Bosnias in our lives, areas where early outside involvement can be decisive and American leadership will be required. The world's richest nation, one that presumes to great moral authority, cannot simply make worthy appeals to conscience and call on others to carry the burden. The world will look to Washington for more than rhetoric the next time we face a challenge to peace.
Please join me in thanking Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. Position himself at the book signing table so that we can purchase and sign books. And I encourage you to do so, just like he did a couple of times during his speech, which was good. Let me say, we've got a list of programs on our table for April. You can see, I will make an announcement today that we've not said before, but in the spirit of his comments and in our continuing programs here at the Clinton School to try to bring interesting, timely, and very noteworthy discussions. We have on May the 7th coming here the Syrian ambassador to the United States. So be sure to mark that down on your calendar. That will be one you will not want to miss. Thank you all for coming. Have a good afternoon.